In the 17th century, cellar workers in northeastern France wore iron wire masks to protect their faces. Not because of war, not because of disease, because their wine kept exploding. Bottles detonated without warning. Glass shrapnel flew across stone cellars. One explosion would strike neighboring bottles and trigger a chain reaction that could destroy an entire vintage in minutes. Workers called it le vin du diable, the devil's wine. Winemakers considered the bubbles a humiliating defect, proof that something had gone horribly wrong during production. Entire batches were poured out. Reputations were ruined. And the monk who is now credited with inventing champagne? He spent most of his career trying to destroy it. The real story of how the world's most celebrated drink came to exist involves an English scientist who figured it out first, a widow who smuggled it past a naval blockade, a czar who became history's first celebrity endorser, and a comet that named the most famous vintage ever produced. The Champagne region of France sits at the northern edge of where grapes can realistically grow. The winters are brutal, and that cold is the entire origin of the problem. When autumn temperatures dropped below freezing, the yeast in fermenting wine went dormant. Winemakers assumed fermentation was complete and bottled the wine. But when spring arrived and temperatures climbed, the dormant yeast woke up inside the sealed bottle and resumed fermenting. Carbon dioxide built up with nowhere to go. Pressure mounted, and the bottles, made from thin, fragile French glass, couldn't take it. The result was chaos. Some bottles simply popped their corks, others shattered violently. Winemakers in Champagne lost anywhere from 20 to 90% of their stock to explosions in bad years. This wasn't a charming quirk, it was a financial catastrophe. Enter Dom Pierre Perignon. Born around 1638, he joined the Benedictine order at 19 and became cellar master at the Abbey of Hauvillers at 28. He held the position until his death in 1715. The legend says he tasted bubbling wine, declared, "Come quickly, I am drinking stars," and invented champagne on the spot. None of that is true. When Dom Perignon died, a monastic inventory of his cellars recorded hundreds of barrels of red and white still wine. Not a single bottle of sparkling wine. He spent decades trying to prevent the bubbles, not create them. He improved blending techniques, pioneered the use of cork stoppers over the oil-soaked rags that winemakers had used before, and secured those corks with rope, a practice that evolved into the wire cages found on champagne bottles today. All of these innovations were designed to keep the wine still and stable. The bubbles were the enemy. The irony is almost painful. The man whose name now graces one of the most expensive champagnes on earth devoted his professional life to eliminating the very thing that made champagne famous. But here's where the story gets stranger. The first person to document how to make wine deliberately sparkling wasn't French at all. He was English. In 1662, 6 years before Dom Perignon even arrived at Hauvillers, an English scientist named Christopher Merritt presented a paper to the Royal Society explaining that adding sugar and molasses to finished wine would trigger a secondary fermentation, producing bubbles. He wasn't guessing. He described a process that English cider and wine merchants were already using, and the English had something the French didn't: strong glass. French glass was blown with wood-fired furnaces, which produced thin, fragile bottles. English glassmakers used coal-fired furnaces, which burned hotter and produced glass that was significantly thicker and more durable. English bottles could contain the pressure that French bottles couldn't survive. So the French had the wine, the English had the science and the glass. Champagne, as a controlled product, was built from both sides of the English Channel, though the French have spent the last 3 centuries making sure nobody remembers that part. For decades, the sparkling wine that survived its bottles remained a novelty. French royalty found the bubbles amusing. The court of Louis XIV reportedly enjoyed sparkling wine at parties. But it was still inconsistent, still dangerous to produce, and still cloudy, filled with dead yeast sediment that made it look murky and unappetizing. That changed because of a 27-year-old widow. In 1805, Barbe Nicole Ponsardin's husband, François Clicquot, died of typhoid fever, leaving her with a 6-year-old daughter and a struggling wine business. In an era when women had almost no legal or commercial rights, widows were the exception. They could inherit and run businesses. Barbe Nicole took control of the house and transformed it. Her first breakthrough was the riddling table, the pupitre. Before riddling, champagne was cloudy because dead yeast settled at the bottom of the bottle, and nobody could get it out without losing the bubbles. The widow Clicquot's solution was elegantly simple. She cut holes in a wooden table, inserted the bottles neck down at an angle, and gradually rotated and tilted them over several weeks. The sediment slowly collected behind the cork. Once concentrated, the neck was frozen, the cork removed, the plug of sediment popped out, and the bottle was recorked, leaving behind crystal-clear, brilliantly golden champagne. This wasn't a minor improvement. It was the difference between a cloudy curiosity with bubbles the size of toads' eyes and the refined, elegant drink that would conquer the world. Riddling made champagne scalable. For the first time, a luxury product could be mass-produced without sacrificing quality. But the widow's most audacious move had nothing to do with production. It was logistics. During the Napoleonic Wars, naval blockades made it nearly impossible to ship French goods to foreign markets. Most champagne houses waited for peace. The widow didn't. She loaded ships with champagne, had them wait at port, and the moment Napoleon was exiled to Elba in 1814, she sailed directly to Russia, arriving before any competitor. The shipment sold out almost instantly. Tsar Alexander I tasted her 1811 vintage, the legendary Year of the Comet, named for the Great Comet that had blazed across the sky during harvest, and declared it the only champagne he would ever drink. The Russian imperial court followed, then the aristocracy, then the rest of Europe, because when a Tsar endorses your product, everyone pays attention. It was, arguably, the first celebrity endorsement in the history of luxury goods. A 27-year-old widow smuggling wine past a naval blockade, capturing the most powerful market in Europe through a combination of timing, courage, and a product that nobody else could match. She also invented the first known blended rosé champagne in 1818, mixing still red wine with sparkling white, a technique still used today. By the time of her death in 1866, Veuve Clicquot was exporting 750,000 bottles annually. The company she inherited was barely selling 10,000. Napoleon himself cemented champagne's association with victory and celebration. He reportedly visited the Champagne region before and after military campaigns, toasting with champagne when he won, consoling himself with it when he lost. His officers adopted the habit. The tradition of celebrating victories with champagne spread through the French military and from there into civilian culture. After Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo, the Congress of Vienna convened to redraw the map of Europe. It was, by all accounts, one of the most extravagant diplomatic events in history. And the drink that flowed throughout? Champagne, much of it supplied by the widow Clicquot herself. By the mid-1800s, champagne was inextricable from the concept of celebration. Ship launches, weddings, New Year's Eve, Grand Prix victories, presidential inaugurations. The association became so deeply embedded in Western culture that popping a cork became a universal symbol of triumph, joy, and new beginnings. Today, the champagne industry produces roughly 300 million bottles a year. The name champagne is legally protected. Only sparkling wine produced in the Champagne region of France, using specific grapes and methods, can carry the title. Everything else is sparkling wine, Prosecco, Cava, or Sect. The French fought legal battles across dozens of countries to enforce this protection, and they largely won. A bottle of Dom Pérignon, named after the monk who tried to eliminate bubbles, now sells for $200 or more. A bottle of Veuve Clicquot, named after the widow who revolutionized everything about how the drink is made, marketed, and shipped, runs about $50 to $60. The monk who hated bubbles became the luxury brand. The widow who actually built the industry became the mid-range classic. 300 years ago, champagne was a defect, an embarrassment, a dangerous malfunction that destroyed cellars, injured workers, and ruined reputations. Winemakers wore masks to protect themselves from it. The greatest cellar master of his generation dedicated his life to stopping it. Today, it's the drink you open when something wonderful happens. The sound of a cork popping is one of the most universally recognized signals of celebration on Earth. Nothing about the chemistry changed. Carbon dioxide trapped in liquid, released when the seal breaks. The same physics that blew apart 17th century cellars now fills flutes at weddings. The only difference is that someone, an English scientist, a stubborn monk, a fearless widow, a conquering emperor, figured out how to control it. And once they did, the defect became the feature, the flaw became the luxury, and the devil's wine became the drink of kings. If this changed how you look at the next bottle you pop, like and subscribe.